Welcome back to the 10th lecture in STEG's virtual course on key concepts and macro development. Thank you for coming. If you're new to the course, all the materials are on the STEG website, which includes the YouTube videos, lecture notes, and chat Q&A, and a syllabus for the course. This is the 10th lecture, as we said. We're very happy to have Yongshin from Washington University giving us a talk. This is the second of two lectures on heterogeneous agents models. Last lecture, Ben Moll talked about methods. He gave us methods in continuous time. Yongs is going to talk about applications of these heterogeneous agents models to development. Let me just quickly, I should thank Mandy Chan, Nadine Clark, Lauren Waring, and Kirsty McNeil at CEPR for helping organize this. And of course, thank our funders, which is, this course is offered as part of the STEG research program, Structural Transformation and Economic Growth. Which is part of the UK aid effort funded by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So we're very appreciative of the funding. We're also very appreciative of Professor Shin because despite the funding, the professors are not getting paid much at all. So they're really doing this out of the goodness of their heart. So ground rules, those of you in the front row, feel free to unmute if you have a clarifying question. Yongs will leave some time at the end for questions. And those of you who are joining through the webinar, you can ask questions in the Q&A. Doug and I will do our best to try to answer those. If there's any that we can't answer, we'll try to give those to Yongs at the end during the question time. Those in the front row, if you're not asking a question, we ask you to please mute. And I'm muting now. And so Yongs, you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for the kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. So this is just labor of love. I get to talk to you all about what I like to do. So as Joe mentioned, my assignment is to talk about some applications of heterogeneous agent models to development. So I'm quoting Richard Rogerson from his first lecture. And he says, you know, one of the key research area right now is the micro-founded macro models for development, because you can simultaneously speak to aggregate outcomes while also addressing a rich set of cross-section effects. So I want to emphasize in particular, it's not only just cross-section effects in particular. So macro development, as you can tell, is a fairly large and active area of research, but there's actually even larger research area right next door, which is the micro development, has been exploding for the last several years, or a couple of decades, I'd say. And then they actually generating, depending on your point of view, a lot of really interesting and useful micro facts and estimates from the real world. And then this is very useful for theorists and quantitative macro people, because those could be a very valuable input to discipline our model, and then let us think about what are the model features that we are missing, what are the things we are not getting right. So this is very important input. Then I see huge gains from intellectual trait. In some sense, I'm just repeating what Mushfiq Mubarak said last week in his lecture. So it's the flow of idea and benefit is just not one direction, because macro development using heterogeneous agent models can actually answer many questions that are very hard to answer using the standard RCT methods. So we'll talk about that. And another thing I want to emphasize is the heterogeneous agent models, because you have different people inside, it's natural that you talk about distributional consequences. So if you actually go back to the from the beginning of the lecture series, it's mostly about understanding GDP gap. Why are some countries poor and others rich? So we really focused on the aggregate output level or consumption level. Even when we had this misallocation literature, which inherently need heterogeneous forms. Forms are very heterogeneous, but at the end of the day, when you're actually closing the model, you tend to have these representative consumers. So there's no real notion of distributional consequence there. So heterogeneous agent models, that the kind of things that Ben has worked on and I've worked on and many other people have worked on, it's natural that you have to talk about distributional consequences within a country, not just the aggregate. Just taking your, showing your picture from a couple of years ago. What is this? This is just number of people living in extreme poverty, defined as less than $1.90 per day. In 1987, so top half is the middle income countries. Countries classified as middle income countries based on their average income. And then bottom is the low income countries. In 1987, the poor people were in low income countries mostly. So thinking about why some countries rich and poor is also directly speaking to the poverty issue. Now, fast forward about 20 years, what you see, about 30 years, what you see is that, well, where are these extremely poor people? The majority of them actually happen to live in countries that's now classified as middle income countries. So you see India, Nigeria, Indonesia, in 1987, they were all low income countries. Now they're classified based on average income, they're classified as middle income countries, but you still have a lot of people in those countries living in extreme poverty. Of course, the number, you can see that the number of people in extreme poverty has grown really small, much smaller. So that's the progress that we've made. But I just want to show you this picture to remind you that, yes, we are really interested in average GDP difference across countries, but also now we can actually go into the countries and then see who's benefiting, who's not, and trying to understand what are the effects, not only on the average GDP, average income, but also the distribution of income within a country. And then heterogeneous agent models will have a natural tool for addressing those questions. So I thought quite a bit about what to do with my applications lecture. So, and then one of the things that I want to talk about was the various types of distortions and everything, but I think Pete Kleiner did a very good job of giving a very good overview of the literature. So I wanted to actually focus on the parts that I think should be more emphasized, meaning the interaction between this micro-level heterogeneity and some kind of frictions. And then I choose financial frictions, mostly because, well, I personally have worked on it. And also, this actually is a large literature that everybody's kind of working on. So I thought, and then there are many papers that I could actually speak to. And the second topic that I talk about today, also using heterogeneous agent models, is industrial policy. Why? Because when I watch these lectures on YouTube, actually, and then especially early on, people are asking about industrial policy. Then I don't think we had actually very good answers because many of the models we write down is an efficient model. So if the allocation is efficient, so there's nothing to really do. So, but once you have various kinds of frictions and market failures, then obviously the government can play a role to improve the situation. And then industrial policy is a topic that we can think more seriously about. So I talk about some examples, and then this is brand new working paper. So I am apologetic about having so many of my papers, but at the same time, these are the papers that I'm most familiar with and most excited about. So, but yes, but I will also talk about other papers. But these are the overview of the lecture today. Okay, so let me go to the first paper. So we are first talking about two papers that emphasize the interaction between micro-level heterogeneity and financial frictions. The first of that paper, and Joe obviously is here. So if you have questions in the Q&A, I'm sure Joe can handle most of them very easily. It's about the macroeconomics of microfinance. So by now, microfinance is ubiquitous and everybody knows about it. If you go back to 2000s, so I'd say those were the periods when we were most optimistic about what microfinance can do to alleviate poverty and also bring growth, economic growth. So like 2005, the United Nations declared 2005 as the year of microfinance, and then they thought this was a key element of their Millennium Development Goal. And 2006, Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in starting microfinance initiatives. very hopeful. And then 2000, and 1 decade later, so some skepticism had set in. So, and a lot of money was going into microfinance, and it was popping up in all countries, and within countries there are more and more people are being serviced by microfinance institutions. But what did we really get out of it? Did it really deliver in its promise that were envisioned in 2000s? Then there's a lot of important papers written in this topic in the micro development side, and then the results are mixed. So sometimes they worked in some countries in different settings, it did not work. And then it's not clear whether it really provides long-run foundations for long-run economic growth. But one thing I want to emphasize is that kind of going back to what I was saying about the kind of questions very hard to answer from the micro literature. These were mostly evaluation of microfinance initiatives that was fairly small scale relative to the aggregate size of the economy. And then also short-run evaluations. You kind of do the intervention for 2 years, and then you see what happened in 2 years. So this, can we just extrapolate, whatever we find here, and I said that the result is already mixed, can we just extrapolate it? And then talk about, okay, so this is small scale. So if we actually make microfinance really a large initiative, and then everybody gets it in a country, and then we actually see what the long run effects are of having such a large intervention. Can we extrapolate what we find from the small scale short run evaluations to predict what's going to happen in the long run over large scale evaluations? And then it's going to be hard, but it's hard to run that kind of large scale and then wait for many years or decades to see the long run effect and identify anything. So we are going to use a theory. Let's write down a model, because this is an experiment we cannot really do in practice. But we will be very careful to draw upon the existing micro and macro evidence, especially the micro evaluations. All the RCTs and evaluations done, there's a rich set of papers and findings. Once you write down the model, let's see whether our model is consistent with those findings. If it's not, then probably we got the model wrong, or we are doing something wrong. Then we have to think about what should be changed in the model. If it's consistent, then maybe there's some credibility that we can use and see whether what doesn't the model predict for the long run. So that is exactly the motivation of this paper. So the kind of things we cannot really do in micro experiment, can we actually do it in theory? Then, but we want to make sure that they are consistent with the existing evidence. The model is fairly standard in the this literature. So you have people, it's a model of entrepreneurship. So people produce as an entrepreneur, but they do have occupation choice. If they want, they can be a worker. And then they are different in terms of productivity as an entrepreneur and productivity as a worker too. So why productivity as a worker is also different across people, because we want to generate some notion of subsistence entrepreneurs, because there are some entrepreneurs who are entrepreneurs because they have great ideas, but also there are some entrepreneurs who are entrepreneurs because they don't have anything better to do. So your opportunity cost of entrepreneurship is your earnings as worker. So that's why we want to have heterogeneous productivity here. And then this is the key. This is a model of financial frictions. That's what microfinance is trying to fix. So if there's no friction financially, then microfinance doesn't have any reason to exist. So the model has collateral constraint to entrepreneur production, which is fairly standard. And then you can also have some consumption loan, but there's some limits as a borrowing limit. So there's financial frictions. The markets are incomplete, obviously. Okay, so these are fairly standard elements. This is equations, but that's not important. Let me tell you what microfinance is in the model. So this is small loan with guaranteed repayment. So we are not clear exactly why microfinance typically has very high repayment rate relative to other commercial loans or different kind of loans, but somehow it works. And there's a long literature that we talk about in our paper, kind of conjecture what exactly is it that make microfinance less default prone. And then microfinance can be used for production for entrepreneurs, but also as consumption. And this is what a lot of people do when they get microfinance. So some microfinance actually has stipulation that you have to use it for production activities, but others don't. So we let people use it for consumption too. And then it interacts with the conventional financing. The detail is not important, but just think about it this way. Microfinance is a very small sized loan. So it expands the choice set of the poor people. The wealthy people, they already have their access to the conventional financing. So microfinance doesn't really improve their life much. But for poor people who have very limited access to conventional financing, microfinance is very important. So that's the idea. Okay, so let's look at what microfinance does to people. So in the model, so for this exercise, we are going to hold the wage and interest rate of the economy fixed. So this is a small scale intervention of microfinance, so it has no reason to change the equilibrium prices. So that's held constant. And then there are many lines, I apologize. So let's kind of focus on these gray lines here, at the black ones. So this is an occupation choice map. Before we go there, so on the horizontal axis, we have the entrepreneur productivity, and then on the vertical axis, we have a wealth. So imagine a world without any financial friction. What should be an occupational choice mean? Who should be the entrepreneur in that world? In that world, the occupational choice will be given by a vertical line somewhere. What's going on? Well, because there's no financial friction, anybody can borrow or like rent capital as much as they want. The people who are able, have high productivity, they will be entrepreneurs. Who are not, will be workers. So fairly standard. But then you have this downward sloping line in world with financial frictions, deviation from this. Look at these people here. Who are these people? Very smart people, but poor. So they cannot be entrepreneurs because they just don't have enough wealth to start their business. And then who are these people who are entrepreneurs who would not be an entrepreneur in a perfect credit world? Who are these people? Well, they are not very productive as an entrepreneur, but they happen to be very wealthy. So it gives them an advantage. So that's why this downward sloping occupation choice line is there. And then how it's different from this vertical line, that's the occupation choice in the perfect credit world, that kind of tells you the degree of talent misallocation. In any case, so let's start from this gray dashed line. So that was the occupational choice in the initial state. And then now you introduce microfinance. Then what you see is that predictably, the set of entrepreneurs expand. And you can see these are predominantly poor people, right? And the poor people, and they happen to be not too extremely productive. So there's kind of marginal entrepreneurs who tend to be very poor. These are people who are most directly affected by microfinance in the occupation choice, because before they would have been workers, but now microfinance gives them just enough access to capital so they can be a productive entrepreneur. But they are not the best ones, obviously. So that's what microfinance does. So there's more entry. And then I plot another thing that's called a saving decision. So this is a very clunky way to plot people's decision rules. So what you see is that you have this line here, and then to the right of it, these people save, and then to the left of it, the people dissave. So what's going on here? I mean, this is one part of the area, actually. So I will not confuse you further, but of course, once you go really to the right, then people with really a lot of wealth, they don't want to save any. But we'll focus on the margin that we're interested in. So what's going on here? So these people are either entrepreneurs or people who are saving to become an entrepreneur. Why? Because they're very productive. They're not necessarily very wealthy, but because they're constrained, the return to their saving is higher than the market interest rate, because they actually are constrained. So their marginal return to capital is higher. The only way you can have more capital in this economy is by saving up to have more collateral. So these people save because their return to savings high. And the other people, they're typically workers. They don't face a particularly high return to saving, and it's an incomplete market model. So their discount rate is higher than the market interest rate, so they tend to dissave. So if you actually just look at the picture, that you may think that, oh, is there a poverty trap here? Meaning people above certain wealth, it actually calls it this way, will actually save and others actually dissave. Does this mean there's poverty trap? Not necessarily, because it is true that if you actually fix someone's ability or entrepreneur productivity fixed over time, then low productive people will continue to dissave and become debt constrained. But that's not what happens in this model. There's actually churning. There's a stochastic entrepreneurial productivity process. So people are being mixed around. So because of that, there's no poverty trap. And then there's a well-defined stationary equilibrium. That's already more like inside the base. But anyways, so now back to the point. What I want to tell you is that look at this. So the set of savers, the fraction of people who are savers actually increase thanks to the microfinance. Again, the dashed line is what was before, the demarcation between savers and dissavers. And now when you introduce microfinance, you see more people who are saving. Why? Again, these are mostly people who also actually change their occupation, and then they actually want to face higher return thanks to microfinance. So they will actually invest more. That's what you see here. So that's just what happened in the model. And then we want to see whether, as I said earlier, is this model even, so this is like science fiction readers have written, and then does this really speak to the data? I mean, if we want to talk about using this model to predict the long-run large-scale intervention of microfinance, and this, we want to make sure that we get the short-run experiment right. So what we do is that we take a model, we take our model, and then implement a microfinance intervention that we think is very close to what we actually see in the real world in a particular country. In Thailand, this is Thai, the Million Baht Village Fund program, analyzed by Joe and Rob Townsend. And then we want to make sure that our model kind of matches the empirical evidence that they find in Thailand closely enough. This is not perfect, but even though we did not target any of these moments, we actually see something very similar happen. So it gives us some assurance that the model we have written down is not completely out of this world. It does speak to micro level changes, micro level responses to microfinance. And in the paper, we also have another comparison with the Banners, Duflo, Glanston, Keenan's study on India, the Spendana expansion program. So we actually show that the model is consistent in its prediction in the short run. So armed with, so let me tell you a little bit more about what happens in our model. So this is the data, comparison with the data, and then we actually look at what happens in the model. And I already showed you what happens in terms of the occupation choice and people's saving decisions. And then let's look at in more detail, who are the people most directly affected by microfinance? You can already know that these are the people who must have been most directly affected. So this is average micro loan that people take out, and then we actually showing people in terms of their entrepreneurial productivity, so really talented entrepreneurs and not so talented entrepreneurs, and these people are mostly workers, obviously. So we have only, like, say, about 20% of people who are entrepreneurs. And then what you see is that either line works. What you see is actually who are the people who take out a larger sized microfinance loan. These are the marginal entrepreneurs, because again, their return to these funds that they have is really valuable. They can use it for production, and because they're credit constrained, they return to this investment side. So you see actually entrepreneurs taking out large loans. The workers, most of these people are workers, so they cover small loans, but they do take out some loans. Why? Because they are using it for consumption loans. So some for people, oh, I want to consume more than today than future, because I'm more impatient than the market interest rate, but microfinance gives me the ability to borrow a little bit more today, so I'm going to use it for consumption. And then change in earnings is concentrated in the kind of marginal entrepreneurs. And as I said, microfinance is a small loan, so it's not going to affect the life of the really talented, rich people. So it's going to be the marginal people, especially the big spike here as the people who change their occupation from being a worker to entrepreneur. And then there's something really interesting about this consumption change. So nobody's earning is falling. Everybody's becoming richer to some degree. But then you actually see some people's consumption is actually dropping. as a result of taking out this microfinance. So what's going on here? So these are basically the people who switch their occupation from being a worker to an entrepreneur. So when they actually take out the loan, now they want to be producing, and they again, when they're entrepreneur, because their credit constraint, the return to their saving is larger. Because saving means more capital tomorrow, and more capital means larger production and higher profit. So that's why these people, once they switch the occupation, will actually save more. So these people switch from being this saver to saver. Their consumption actually drops, even though their earnings actually increase. And then Joe's paper with Rob actually has some consistent evidence with this interesting feature. So these are table that we just showed, and this micro level consistency with the empirical evidence gives us a little bit of confidence that, yeah, we can actually use this model as a laboratory to talk about what are the long run large consequences and largest scale intervention. Yeah. So any question? So let's continue then. So again, feel free to interrupt. Just unmute yourself and ask a question. So I cannot see you raising hand or anything like that. So short-run effect. So what are we doing here? So prices are fixed, and then we are just increasing the limit of the microfinance loan. So you have a small microfinance, but you could, it's still small, but you could be raising this limit that can be given to people in terms of through microfinance institutions. So see what happens in short-run partial equilibrium effect is that you see the capital use increase in the economy. Why? Makes sense, right? So now you have more entry, more people are becoming entrepreneurs, and then the marginal entrepreneurs are using microfinance to scale up their production. So there's more use for capital. So it's alleviating the financial friction. And then output increases. But what's interesting is that total factor productivity actually is going down. So what's going on? It's all selection. So microfinance does two things. Obviously, it's expanding people's choice set. So in terms of resource allocation and financial constraint, it is alleviating the financial constraint. So there's actually force for better allocation of resources and higher TFP. But the reason why it's not happening here is that, look at this. Now with larger and larger microfinance limit, you have more and more people become entrepreneurs. Then with that, the average productivity of entrepreneurs is falling because the distribution of productivity in the economy hasn't changed. But now more and more people are entrepreneurs. That means that the average quality of those business ideas are going down. So that's why the TFP is going down. And obviously, the short-term partial equilibrium. So what's happening is that the economy, there's excess demand for workers and excess demand of capital, but this partial equilibrium, so we assume that it comes from outside the economy to do this. But this is worth emphasizing, that the capital use increases, but TFP falls a little bit, but then output increase. This is what happened in a short run, partial equilibrium, if you actually look at the impact of microfinance. What about long run? So long run effect is very different. And also not only long run, skipping one, but long run, and this is general equilibrium. So prices are adjusting and markets are clear, unlike the partial equilibrium. So here again, this is capital and GDP increase and TFP falls. You basically a very different picture. You see actually TFP increasing in the long run, but then capital in the economy actually is falling. Okay. So what is happening? Capital is falling in the economy because, well, before microfinance, productive entrepreneurs have to self-finance, so that means they have high saving rate. But once microfinance comes, some of the marginal entrepreneurs, they don't have to save as much because they can rely on microfinance to run their businesses. Not only that, there are workers who will be net borrowers. They are taking out microfinance as consumption loan. So this entire saving curve of the economy shifts to the left, and that's why in the long run, the capital of the economy actually falls, the more if for larger limits of microfinance. And then TFP of the economy actually increases. So it's not really selection effect. As you can see, the average productivity of an entrepreneur in the economy doesn't really change. relative to the limit of microfinance. But this is what's happening here is that microfinance allows entrepreneurs to actually be less credit constrained, especially the marginal entrepreneurs, and that does leads to better allocation of capital and hence improves the TFP, measured TFP as a result of better allocation. So that's what's happening in general equilibrium, and you see that actually interest rate is rising. Right. So, and that's not surprising because people don't want to save. And as I said, the saving curve is shifting to the left. That naturally means the equilibrium interest rate of the economy has to rise. So that's what's happening here in the general equilibrium in the long run. Okay. So these are both aggregate effects. So since I talked about the distributionary effect, so let's talk about distributionary effect. So we are taking care of all the transition dynamics. So at time 0, we are sorting people by wealth on the left-hand side and then by their entrepreneurial productivity on the right-hand side. And then one thing I want to say is that in the partial equilibrium world, when prices are fixed, nobody can get worse off because of microfinance. Why? Because price hasn't changed and your opportunity set has expanded. So you cannot do worse than before. So that's fine. And in partial equilibrium, in terms of the wealth, who are the people who benefit? These people who are not very rich. Who are these people? These tend to be marginal entrepreneurs, and it could also include some workers. And then for them, welfare increases because for marginal entrepreneurs, they become entrepreneurs, and then workers, they could actually smooth their consumption better. In terms of the ability percentile, it's even clearer that the people who really benefit from in partial equilibrium, these are dashed lines. So the people who really benefit are the marginal entrepreneurs. It's not the top people, it's actually people in the middle, but or a lower end of the entrepreneur, active entrepreneurs. Again, its percentile is 100%, but not everybody's entrepreneurs. We have about between 20 and 30 people, 30% of people are entrepreneurs. These are more marginal people that they do directly benefit. And but you see is that even workers benefit. So this, if you're really low in your productivity, you are definitely a worker, and that you benefit because you're using consumption law. In general equilibrium, things change a little bit. It still have the solid lines of the general equilibrium cases. It is clearly the case that the marginal entrepreneurs benefit here. But then, especially in terms of wealth, it becomes really clear. You see that like really wealthy people benefit in general equilibrium as a result of the microfinance intervention. Why? Well, that's because interest rate goes up. So for really rich people, they are not really credit constrained anymore because they have enough collateral. But then the return to their saving goes up, so they actually benefit quite a bit. So who benefits? Again, partial equilibrium says, well, it's the marginal people. And then in general equilibrium, because interest rate changes, that no, the richest people actually benefit the most. And another interesting, you can barely see here, actually the paper has a better 3D graph as well. You actually see some people who are worse off. So just below 0, you see actually some people are worse off because of microfinance intervention in general equilibrium. So what's going on? So these tend to be somewhat marginal entrepreneurs who are not really credit constrained, but for them, the problem is that the factor price increases. Interest rate goes up means capital rental price goes up. So for them, the increased factor price means that there's a smaller profit and they actually worse off in general equilibrium, even if you take into account all the transition dynamics. Okay, so the distribution effect is very different. Not only the aggregate quantities are different between the short-run partial equilibrium versus long-run general equilibrium, but also distribution effect is very different. Okay? So that's the sense in which we say that, well, you know, we learn a lot from the short-run evaluation of microfinance, and these are typically small-scale interventions, so you observe partial equilibrium results, and that looks very different from long-run general equilibrium effect when you imagine expanding the microfinance to the whole economy and then raise the limit of microfinance and wait a long period. What's going to happen to the economy? That looks very different from what we actually see from the short-run evaluations. So what we did in this paper is that we use actually the key important thing that I want to emphasize is that we use microevaluation evaluation evidence to discipline our model analysis. So it is another rich source of data that you can use to not only to calibrate the model, but also think about what are the model features that we must have to be consistent with the micro level data. Then we are using this model to answer questions that cannot be answered by typical micro evaluations. This is what I mean by the gains of intellectual trade between micro development and macro development. And then, as Mushfiq mentioned last week, now you see, I'm just citing 2 papers here, but actually more. So there are more and more papers who are actually trying to bring insights from both sides to answer the important development question. And yeah, and that's where this paper actually fits. So I'm going to move to the next paper. So if you have any question that you want to ask now, please feel free to do that. Yeah. If not, let me move on. So before we talk about the next paper, this is where I take a step back and think about, okay, what are the kind of missing things? What could we have done better? So the model, the only thing that's wrong in this model is that, well, the financial market is not functioning properly. And then obviously that includes market incompleteness, that people cannot insure. So there are actually 2 distinct things. People cannot really insure against the future shocks. They can only do self-insurance. And then, but borrowing limit, there's an ad hoc borrowing limit. Not only the production side, there's a financial friction. So, I mean, that's in some sense a lot, but is this a correct description of, say, the Thai village or the Indian urban area that we just talked about? Okay. Clearly not. There are financial friction, obviously, is one key friction, but there are a lot of things that's not working properly in these countries. Everything is correlated, right? So labor market is not functioning as well as it should. Product market is not functioning as well as it should. And then you can think of the migration restriction and mobility cost and all kinds of things. So there are many things that's actually not working well in these models, in these countries. So we just took one step and just say, well, financial friction is what we focus on, so everything else works perfectly fine. But this could be, and we did kind of look at our model performance relative to the empirical evidence, but I think you wonder whether if there are different kinds of frictions and if they interact in a very interesting way, is there something we're missing by modeling this way? I mean, economists by nature, we want to make a point, a sharp point. So we don't want to have all kinds of things in our model, right? So we want to take a stance on financial frictions, then you write on a model with the financial frictions and nothing else. But the world is very complicated. And then in the real world, obviously, these frictions interact with one another. So just kind of making inference about the role or the importance of financial frictions or what will happen if we introduce microfinance, this becomes very complicated in my view. So this is actually difficult. It's a conceptually difficult one, and it actually goes against the grain of the typical economist spirit, which is we want to abstract and we want to focus on what we think is the most important one. But I think, so there is just not many models. I've seen a few, but there are not that many models considering the interaction between the various kind of financial friction, various types of frictions. Financial friction is product market friction, labor market friction, information friction, or all kinds of stuff. So I think this could be one interesting area that people could think about, especially if, and we don't know this for sure yet, but if just effects of frictions are additive, that's not very interesting, right? So then, okay, so they don't interact. You just add one friction, then you get this partial effect. Then there's not much to be gained by doing that exercise. But until we work this out, it's going to be hard for us to tell whether these effects of frictions is simply additive or actually interact in an interesting way. I think that's something aspiring economists could actually look into. So I'm sure there are a lot of things missing, but the other thing missing that I thought in this paper and many of these papers is that we typically assume that the entrepreneur productivity or the worker productivity is exogenous to the given stochastic process. But clearly that's not the case, right? So people can invest in their human capital, people can invest in their managerial productivity, and there are actually many papers that are taking this issue seriously. So I think, so that's a natural segue into the next paper. So the next paper is actually about the endogenous productivity as manager and a worker. Okay, so this is paper by Masturi, Shaw, and Townsend. Okay, by the way, all the paper I cite in the back of the slide, there's a reference section where I kind of give the detailed information. So the title is Human Capital Acquisition and Occupational Choice, Implications for Economic Development. So if you think about the microfinance paper that you just saw, we focused on one thing, the role of financial frictions in production for entrepreneurs. But then they realized that no, it interferes with your entrepreneurial investment, but also human capital investment, especially if you have children. So I think this is a step forward, meaning you don't have multiple sources of frictions. There's still financial frictions, but you get to talk about how various margins get distorted by this friction. And to talk about children's human capital investment, obviously you need a life cycle model and overlapping generations. And then that enlarges the kind of inequality we can talk about. Now we can also talk about intergenerational mobility. So that's the key focus of this paper. So the empirical evidence, so the paper has empirical side and the quantitative side, as is usual in this literature. So they look at Mexican panel data. And then they said, well, there seems to be, well, at this point, it's not really causal, but there's actually empirical evidence suggesting that there's credit constraints for both entrepreneurs and also human capital investment. And a really interesting finding is that if you actually focus on below median wealth households, so these are not the wealthy households, for these people, if they run a modern business, so actually there's two kinds of entrepreneurship, subsistence business, which is not a very good business model, and then there's modern business, which is more like a real business. So people who are running modern business, so they should be better off in terms of permanent income sense than people who are subsistence entrepreneurs, but they actually invest less in the children's schooling. So this actually is a motivation for thinking about the same financial friction distorting both investment and human capital. So for these people, the hypothesis you can make is, oh, they are really facing really high return on their business. So they actually invest more in their business. So they don't have any money left to pay for children's school costs, education costs. And also they probably want the children to work in the business because there's a large opportunity cost of children going to school for them. So this is actually very interesting empirical finding, and I think this is kind of natural motivation for writing down a model like this. So if you actually look at the paper, this is fairly involved paper because it has a real life cycle. So it's not just two-period OLG model. It actually is people live for long periods, and there's a connection between parents and children. It's fairly challenging model to actually digest, but again, as I said, it's worth it because we can ask interesting questions like this, the financial friction, how it distorts investment margin and the human capital margin. And also we can talk about various kinds of inequality. So the papers are a bit too dense for me to actually try to go through in a very short period of time. So let me actually just give you a punchline. So they do, once you have a model, that's fully consistent with the various micro evidence that they look at. One counterfactual they do is say, okay, let's remove borrowing constraint and see what happens. So total output increases. That's not surprising. But what is really interesting, I think, is this part. The total human capital in the economy goes up by only 2%. So you say, oh, okay, so that's not very important, but actually it is very important. So what's happening here? The standard deviation of human capital in the economy is increasing. So what's going on? So basically, with a lot of borrowing constraint, smart kids from poor families do not get much education. But at the same time, not so smart kids from very rich family actually get a lot of education. Because financial constraint binds, so your family wealth is one key determinant of your education. But once you get rid of borrowing constraint, now, regardless of family background, all the smarter kids get more education, especially the smart kids from less wealthy family. And also not so smart kids, they do not get as much education or skill acquisition. Okay. So the average, so somebody's getting more education, a lot of people are not getting as much education, so the total gap rate is not changing much, but then actually the dispersion is large, and that actually has important implications for not only aggregate quantitative, but also distribution. So for example, the intergenerational mobility increases, meaning correlation between wealth, family wealth, and kid human capital, the correlation goes down. Again, there's still correlation because actually there's some genetic component in intergenerational linkages, so that's the assumption. Then entrepreneurship falls, but then that's mostly because the wrong kind of entrepreneurs, the subsistence entrepreneurs who are entrepreneurs only because they don't have anything better to do. So there's a huge decline for them, and actually the modern business increase. So again, as I said, this is a very rich model that allows you to speak to not only aggregate quantities, but also very detailed inequality changes, distribution or constancies of financial frictions. So that's something that I'd wrap up this first part of the paper, lecture with. Okay, so I'm going to go to industrial policy unless there is some question that anyone wants to ask. Okay, so if not, let me jump into the industrial policy. Again, it's due to popular demand. I saw the lectures, and then especially early parts, there are many people, I should not say many, but there's several people who talked about this topic. So I thought it was actually worthwhile bringing in this into the lecture, and we are going to use heterogeneous agent models. So I think the papers I list here are actually something you want to read at some point, if you're interested in this topic. So Krugman's essay was about, so in the 1560s, there's all this talk of big push and linkages and kind of things pioneered by Albert Hirschman and Rosenstein Rodan people. And that literature sort of disappeared. I mean, it had a huge influence in policymakers, but then the literature in economics have disappeared. And then Krugman kind of talks about how just having things described in words kind of was the downfall of that literature. And then he praises the model by Murphy, Schleifer, Vishnu, the big push model, and then shows how simple it is, how elegant it is, and then how that could actually have a huge impact for the economics literature and also policy making. Anne Kruger, in her presidential address of the AEA, she talks about a brief intellectual history of the industrial policies. And early on, for example, people were very focused on import substitution. So there's a big debate on import substitution versus export-oriented policies. And obviously, by now, everybody will say that, well, the evidence says that export-oriented policies are the most successful ones. So you would think, why would anyone want to propose the import substitution? And what she actually shows is that, well, there were actually economic logic there. So there were some assumptions, and it turns out the assumptions were actually flawed. But given the assumptions, the economists of those days actually thought import substitution actually is the right policy to do. So this is a kind of discussion about how we went from import substitution to export-oriented policies. But in both cases, actually, there's a lot of role for the government. There's nobody said laissez-faire. The government actually should be involved, whether it's import substitution, export driven, but the government had to play a big role. And then that gave way to the Washington Consensus of the late 90s and early 2000s, which was it goes together with the liberalization of the ex-communist countries that no, the government has no role to play other than having a level playing field. Everything should be liberalized. So that was the mantra. So it's a 180-degree turn in thinking, policy thinking, right? So there's a lot of involvement for the government, whether import or export. But then now, no, let's go to liberalization. And then, unfortunately, that didn't really pan out any better. So then Roderick kind of thinks about, so Roderick's paper is titled The Industrial Policy of the 21st Century. So it kind of talks about, okay, so this is what we learned. These are the kind of things that the government should be focusing on if they want to promote economic activity. And then he, for example, emphasizes the private and public partnership in terms of technology adoption. And then we'll come back to technology adoption in the last paper I will discuss today. Okay. So this is for you to read. This is actually very interesting bedtime read. Nothing technical there, but it enriches your understanding of the history of industrial policy. So one paper we wrote with Bagu and Ben in 2013, which is asking a simple question. There are actually two questions we were asking. One is there a role for government policy in the process of development? There's anything the government can do. And the second is we have all these idiosyncratic distortions, and that turned out to be actually positively correlated with the productivity form. When I say positive, meaning productive forms tend to be taxed at a higher rate, and less productive forms tend to be subsidized. So that's why we've seen the data. So where does this thing come from? And I think actually one of the students asked this very question in Richard's lecture and also in Pete's. And so why do we have it? Obviously, it's hard to justify this thing if you are thinking of in a static sense, but we thought, okay, maybe there's a theory for why we have this. So this is a very simple model. It's I would say just a proof of concept. It's not a serious normative or positive exercise. It's just kind of showing you that, yeah, we can answer these questions in one way. So what's going on in that paper? So standard entrepreneur production subject to financial frictions. Simple model, close to what you saw in the microfinance paper. So statically, in a given period, the GDP and a TFP of the economy can be increased if government looks at the firms with the highest marginal product of capital. So these are the firms that are most credit constrained, and subsidize them. And subsidize them, and the credit constraints are relaxed. Okay, and then of course, how do you provide a subsidy? Well, you have to tax other firms. So statically, that's something you can do because there's a friction is there. By introducing another distortion, you can actually improve. Okay, it's not optimal. We're not saying anything about optimality here. It's just that it's a proof of concept. It can be done. It is actually very, very easy to get it done in a static sense. There's a twist. Once you give the subsidy to the firms, well, it may become very hard to remove the subsidy from them. You gave them subsidy, and then it's going to be very hard for you to go back the next period and then, okay, you don't deserve the subsidy anymore. Okay, so we can think of the capture by lobbying groups, and we quote Milton Friedman, who used to say, "Well, nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program." Right. So once you have a temporary government program, these things become permanent. So that's the sort of idea. Okay, so the idea is that at time zero, you give subsidy to these really productive firms. That's a good idea because they are credit constrained, high marginal product of capital. You give them subsidy, the GDP of the economy goes up. You have to tax some other firms, but that's still okay. The problem happens afterwards. You may be the most productive firm in time zero, but if you wait long enough, eventually there's mean reversion in stochastic process that you will not be such a firm at the frontier of productivity. So you become like a marginal or even like below average entrepreneur. The problem is you still have the subsidy. So that is the assumption. And it's not a crazy assumption. So you still have the subsidy. Now, in the long run, you are not very productive, but you still have subsidy, so you're still in business. You shouldn't be in business, but you're in business. So that's the idea. So short-run gains, the government can intervene in the economy, and then you improve the economy, but then it has negative consequences in the long run. So that's the idea. And here, this is the average productivity of entrepreneurs. Those who are subsidized here, you see that initially you choose the ones who are the most productive. So average subsidy recipients are much more productive than other entrepreneurs. But then over time, mean reversion take over, and they become above average and above average entrepreneurs. And you look at this, their share of capital and the subsidized firms, initially they take about 40% of total capital, they produce about 40% of total GDP. That's fine. But over time, what happens is that they still eat 40% of the capital in the economy, but then they only contribute like less than 20% of the GDP of the economy. So you can see this big misallocation here. So they are just dragging down the economy. And then here, one thing again, so the role of the government is something we asked about. And then the second question we had is that why do we have all these idiosyncratic distortions that correlate with productivity? And you have an answer here. Why? Because you have all these firms, very unproductive, but they are subsidized and they stay in business. So you generate this like a subsidized unproductive firms in the economy that generates this positive correlation between tax and productivity or subsidy and negative productivity. Okay. So this is output. So you see this black line here. That's what initially the government did it well. So you targeted the right guys. Your GDP jumped up by 13%. But over time, well, these guys still have subsidy, but now they're getting worse and worse. That GDP, and then you're taxing everybody for that, for their subsidy. The GDP actually falls below the initial level, and then becomes 10% lower in the long run. And one easy thing you can do to fix these things that give a stochastic expression of subsidy. But I mean, it's not very serious. I mean, the whole point is this, right? So once you give subsidy to someone, it's hard to take it away. But somehow, if you can have a sunset clause and really commit to take away the subsidy, then it could be actually viable industrial policy. That these are the lines here. So initially, you increase the GDP, you are subsidizing the right guys, and now they become worse and worse, but then their subsidy expires, so you still have a little bit small negative consequence that depending on your discounting, it may be still worthwhile policy. So that's the idea. And Iskoke-Moore is related, but it's much more serious exercise. It's a normative exercise.
Can I jump in here? So a lot here depends on mean reverting productivity. Is there any empirical evidence that that's true?
I think absolutely. So even in the US, think about this. You often see these things that you look at the list of Fortune 500 countries in 1980, right? And then look at a list of Fortune 500 countries in 2021. What fraction of them do you think will overlap? This farm productivity are very fast mean reverting, right? So like farms like Ford, Ford is kind of doing okay, but Chrysler, IBM, these were the kind of the biggest farms, the most productive farms if you go back 30 years. But then now actually it's more dominated by firms like Apple, Google, and these kind of firms. So not, maybe precisely because we are in such a competitive environment in the US, but from productivity is a very fastly mean reverting. And then that's, I think if you take a longer run view, that is always true. The leading firms change. And then you look at data from, okay, so let me just say one thing and then I move on to the next one. So like, for example, in a country like Korea, where I come from, what happens is that initially these firms are super productive. In their case, what happens is that it's not that they retain the subsidy. What happened in those countries, in Korea, for example, is that you kind of invest in these very productive firms in the 70s. The government invests and give them opportunities, and they do a great job, so very successful. But then, because they have become so large and successful, they have so much market power in many different industries. So there's no explicit subsidy, but then that market power is playing the role of this subsidy here. That once they have this market power, then they enter into industries in which they are not very productive in, but then they're the dominant player because they come in with the market power and the access to credit and everything. So it also has negative consequences in the long run. So I just say that's actually a universal fact that you actually look at.
And so productivity would sort of be more of a catch-all. It could be market power that is growing. It could be actually productivity that is decreasing. So in them, although this is more of a catch-all factor.
No, so what I meant to say is that productivity is productivity, but what I was saying is that some firms are dominant players, not because they are very productive firm, but they still have the market power. So that's what I meant to say.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
But the mean reversion in productivity is everywhere. Yes, especially if you look at the kind of longer run view, I think it's true everywhere. Okay. So again, Iskoke-Moore is very similar idea, but much more serious exercise. And then here, it's not about subsidizing fractional firms and some firms and not others. It's mostly about between workers and entrepreneurs, firms. Okay, so simple model of collateral constraint is so simple that actually they can solve it by hand, characterize a lot of things by hand. So there's a collateral constraint. This is the justification for government intervention. Again, if there's no friction, then there's no business for government, but there's a collateral constraint. And because there's collateral constraint, entrepreneurial wealth is a factor of production. Why? You need wealth to acquire capital. And because there's a collateral constraint for entrepreneurs, the return on wealth for entrepreneurs, because they can use their wealth to get more capital and produce, that return is much higher than the return to wealth for workers who just get the market interest rate in a small open economy. So planner wants to take advantage of this. So planner thinks about, okay, entrepreneur wealth is actually a factor of production. And then if I give more wealth to the entrepreneur, then because they have higher return, it could benefit the entire economy, and I can just pay back the workers afterwards, right? So that's the margin that the planner is playing on. Then obviously, it's not one thing that's ruled out is that grab wealth of the worker and give it to entrepreneur. That's ruled out. So what the Ramsey planner uses is the income tax. So what the Ramsey planner does is that, okay, I'm going to subsidize labor. I'm subsidizing labor. So that sounds like good. Oh, that's good for the workers. No, it's not, because actually, well, where does the subsidy come from? Well, I'm going to use a lump sum tax. I'm going to tax the workers to actually pay for their own subsidy. Okay, so it's not a good deal for workers. Their labor supply margin is distorted, but it's not like they are earning more money. But they subsidize labor that make labor cheaper for the firms, that increase the profit of entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs have more profits, so they can save more, so they can grow faster, right? So they have a very nice formulation showing that the labor income tax is this formula, has this formula. So monopoly effect, meaning the planner cares about the workers. So by suppressing the supply of labor, you can boost up the wage of workers. It's kind of like what trade unions do. So that effect is there, but minus this dynamic productivity effect, meaning, look, if there's a high return on entrepreneur wealth, then labor income tax, if this time is the return on, basically the return on entrepreneur wealth. If this is high, small number, large negative number, you have a negative labor tax, meaning subsidy for the workers. But of course, if you could get close to the steady state, the return on entrepreneur wealth is smaller. They are not as constrained, basically, so that the monopoly effect cannot take over. So let me just kind of focus on one of these lines. There are many different lines, but the story is that labor income tax looks like this. It depends on how much the planner cares of the workers. There's your subsidize the workers, and then, but later, increase tax. It's kind of counterintuitive, but even the planner this is a quantitative result, much more complicated model, but in the theoretical result, even if the planner only cares of workers, they still do this pro-business policy, meaning subsidizing labor input, but later pay back workers by restricting labor supply. So this is the margin that the government is using. So there's a role for the government to play here. And then you see that the blue line here is the path of GDP in laissez-faire if the government doesn't do anything. And then the green line or the black line you see is what the government does, the Ramsey planner does by using this tax policy. So you see that there's actually some change between the green line and the blue line, but the impact is not that large, about 1% increase in permanent consumption. So there's a faster growth in GDP early on, but also there's a slower growth later on. So the thing about these papers, they actually answer positively to the question, there's the role for government policy in the process of development. But what you see is that, well, whether we look at this example or this policy, it's Moore's paper, the effects seem to be fairly modest. We're not talking about government policy generating stupendous growth. Okay? So that led us to think about a more different model. So this is the final paper I talk about today. The big push in distorted economies, we just kind of had it out about a month ago. It's the same question, is there a role for government policy in process development? Okay, so there had something that's not working properly in the market to actually do this. And then we also ask, is there a model that gives really large, quantitatively large effect from idiosyncratic distortions? Idiosyncratic distortions do generate quite a bit, but as you kind of discovered, the effect of the idiosyncratic distortions still not enough to explain cross-country income differences, for example. Okay, so can we actually generate a model where this actually matters more? Okay. And we are thinking about policy as reducing distortions or subsidizing technology adoption. So this is model over technology choice. And then these are the kind of policy tools you were thinking about. So I'm not sure how many of you actually are familiar with the big push paper of Murphy H. Life of Michigan. So that was actually a beautiful paper. the whole paper is about constructing multiple equilibrium. And then the idea was that you could be stuck in a bad equilibrium, that the government can intervene and coordinate or just persuade people and move to the better equilibrium. But precisely, it's so spatially structured to make it multiple equilibrium model. It didn't have an immediate quantitative counterpart. And if you actually listen to Richard Rogers in his very first lecture, and I mean, one student asked about this big push, and Richard was skeptical, right? So he said, well, I'm not sure that actually there's really multiple equilibrium. There's going to be fundamental differences. It's not really multiple equilibrium story. So what we are thinking is, okay, is there a notion of a big push, even if there's no multiple equilibrium? And we think it's important because there's a fair amount of skepticism of multiple equilibria. This is a beautiful model, but then if people are skeptical about the notion of multiple equilibrium, then this will not have a very big impact, both in the literature and also in the policy circles. So we want to have actually more quantitative version and talk about big push, even with a multiple equilibrium. Okay. So the model elements, since I don't have that much time, I will go a little bit quickly here. So somewhat standard, or a bit different from what we just talked about, but then somewhat standard, if you know the trade literature, for example, the differentiated goods in the monopolistic competition, and then it gets aggregated into a final good. And then the funniest thing is it's a static model, it's a one-period model, basically. So what is kind of interesting is that to produce these differentiated goods, you need this final good. So it's a very circular production structure. It's very confusing, but we're not the first one, obviously. There's, for example, a very well-known paper by Chad Jones on this roundabout production. And then firms are different in terms of their productivity, and then they choose their technology. There's a less productive technology and there's a more productive technology. But to use the more productive technology, you need to pay the adoption cost, and the adoption good is in this units of finite goods. Okay, so that's the idea. And then we want to talk about complementarity in this technology adoption decision. What is complementarity in technology adoption decision? Basically, we're asking if there are more firms that are adopting this technology, does my return to adoption of this technology increase? If yes, there's a complementarity, right? So the more other people are doing it, the more you want to do it, right? So let's see whether there's complementarity. We just understand, for example, to verify whether it's complementarity or not, we just understand what's happening. So if there are more firms that are adopting this productive technology, what's the effect on me, a marginal firm that is deciding whether I should adopt the technology or not? So if more firms are adopting, what are the consequences? First, because more firms are becoming productive, their marginal cost is going down. Hence, the output price that I'll be charging goes down, right? So I'm not a monopolist. I'm a monopolist competition. So like the aggregate price index matters for my pricing decision. So if more firms are productive and things are getting cheaper because their marginal cost goes down, my price is going down. So this holding other things equal, this hurts my profit, and hence probably I don't want to adopt the technology. At the same time, because my output is an input to the production of other people, other firms. So if other firms are producing more, means that they are demanding more of my output as well. There's input-output linkages that for them to produce, they would need more of my output. And also, the adoption cost of adoption is a unit of finite goods that actually, if more firms are adopting, the price of the goods go down because these firms are becoming productive and lower marginal cost, my adoption cost falls. Okay. So the sum of 2 and 3, the effect of the sum of 2 and 3 is actually larger than the negative effect of 1. Then my gains from adoption actually increases the number of adopters. So there's complementarity in adoption decisions. So what we are saying here is that, well, it's not like always the case. So you have to find the model. If you really want this very strong complementarity, then you have to kind of think about how to weaken effect number 1 and how to strengthen effect number 2. So this is like a little of inside of baseball, but like what Murphy like vision they do is that they do 2 things. I mean, only one of them was necessary, but what they do is that first of all, they actually assume that, well, there's a Cobb-Douglas preference so that the expenditure share across industries is the same, so that this just kills this output price effect. And then not only that, but they do actually have competitive fringe. So your price doesn't fall because everybody's price is kind of determined by a competitive fringe, regardless of what other people actually do, what other firms do, your price doesn't fall. So in that model, I just want to say that effect one basically is not operating. So you only have 2 and 3. So this is very favorable for having complementarity and adoption, and they do actually have multiple equilibrium because of that. Okay, so complementary is stronger when different goods are less substitutable. This is what I meant about the Murphy-Schleiffer-Wishon use, the Cobb-Douglas preference. And if there's a smaller heterogeneity in firm productivity, in Murphy-Schleiffer-Wishon, they have a heterogeneous, so firms are every homogeneous firm. All firms have the exact same productivity, and this helps complementarity or multiplicity. Why? If everybody's very different, whatever other people do doesn't really affect me. I'm so different from them, right? So heterogeneity, it goes against complementarity multiplicity. But if everybody is kind of alike, then well, if it's good for them, then it must be good for me too, right? So heterogeneity plays an important role. So that's why the older models of multiplicity always have kind of homogeneous forms. And then, yeah, so there's something about production technology. We'll skip. Okay. So what with the key part of the paper, I try to wrap up within the next 5 minutes. The key part of the paper is that, well, obviously when complementarity is strong enough in Murphy-Schleiffer-Wishon case, there's a multiple equilibria, so you can talk about it. But even if the complementarity is not strong enough to generate multiple equilibria, there is still amplification of the effects of distortions and policies. And we like this because actually policy implications are very different. Again, if this is multiple equilibrium, first people are skeptical, and not only that, the policy implications, well, you just coordinate people's activity. You just tell people to move from one equilibrium to the other. But then if there's amplification, well, just talking to them will not do much. You actually have to do some real work, like reducing distortions or subsidizing the adoption cost. So this is the impact of distortions. Okay, let me just kind of skip the multiplicity part because it's not such a big part of the paper anyways. So what we find is we calibrate using the microdata in the US and India. US is the yellow line here, ignore the blue and red here. What it shows that regardless of the degree of distortion, in the US, you have only one equilibrium. But in India, you start, Indian economy actually is somewhere here, but then actually you change the distortions. India is in the region of multiplicity, so that there is actually some narrow region of this interval of this distortion where you have a good equilibrium and bad equilibrium. And what you find is actually India is a good equilibrium. So multiplicity doesn't explain the India-US income gap anyways. But here the policy is really interesting, right? So you start here, you're in a bad equilibrium, really low output, but then you reduce your distortion a little bit, then you can actually have a chance to jump to this good equilibrium. So this kind of very discontinuous. So there's here another way to say is that small change in distortions, a very small, tiny, moderate reform could have a very discontinuous effect on output in India. But that is kind of true in this US calibration where there's no multiplicity, that you have this region, this area where small change in distortion can have a really large effect. So this is what we actually call the region, a big pushy region. So even if there's no multiplicity. And the couple of things I will say before I wrap up. The first thing is, we are now using the US model. So blue line is the US. Basically, US has no distortions in our calibration, and then you increase distortion by how much your output and consumption fall. What is the purple lines? These purple lines are basically, think of the standard models in the literature. The Restuccia Rogerson papers here, and then there's another paper, say Bento Restuccia paper, that does have some technology adoption, but does not have this input-output structure that we have. Their distortions have some effect, sizable effect, but not that much. It reduces the GDP by about 30%, even for like a really extreme degree of but in our models, the blue line here, actually, you see huge impact of distortions, especially around here. So around 0.2, the small change in distortion can have a really large effect. And green and red are variation of our models, so these are kind of similar, and they all have this region, big push region. And the line that you see here, the light blue line, dashed line, that's actually a model of roundabout production, the input-output structure that we have, but with no technology choice. So it does have a more effect than the standard models, but the effect is still smaller than what we actually have in the model of technology choice and the input output. And this is the policy. Again, this is showing if you change your cost of technology adoption, like subsidy a little bit, by how much the output or consumption of the economy actually changes. And then you see that there's some regions where a small change, some regions where distortions are kind of intermediate. Small subsidy can have a really large effect on the output, both in the US calibration and the India calibration. So there's a big push region. And then, well, one thing that this theory is telling you is that, well, some policies was in some countries actually a successful industrial policy, and others it doesn't. In others, they are not as successful. And maybe, well, it depends on where you are, right? So if you are in a country happen to be near this region, big pushy region, small reform can have a large effect. But if you are in other regions, that small reforms will have a very small effect, so it's not going to be successful. Same here. If you happen to be here, small change in subsidy, big effect. If you're here, small change in subsidy doesn't do anything. So it could be actually a theory of why some reforms are more successful than others. So let me try to wrap up. So heterogeneous agent models in macro development. I think the key advantage is that we get to fully utilize the empirical evidence, especially micro evaluations, by looking at a model with a full-blown heterogeneity. We can answer important questions that's hard to answer just using micro evaluations. So I think there's a huge gains of intellectual trait that Mushfiq also emphasized last week. And it's heterogeneous agents, so it's natural focus on distribution of consequences of welfare implication across different people. And I think this is really important because now the cross within country income distribution and poverty is a big issue, not just cross country. And then this will be self-serving, but we've been playing with these lumpy models with lumpy investment and technology choice, and they seem to be very useful model for understanding data. But good news for you all is that still there's so much work to be done. I already mentioned interaction of different sources of frictions and all. Let me have an epilogue very quickly. So we mostly talked about the role of frictions and misallocation in explain the level rather than growth rates. Then, this is something that Richard also emphasized in the first lecture, that he thinks that no, it's really about going from a low level to catching up the frontier. It's not really about changing the frontier growth rate, but I think there's something to be still learned in this literature. And then I refer you to an excellent paper by Michael Peters that came out in Econometrica. He has endogenous growth model and kind of talks about how frictions and misallocations affect growth rates. The spoiler is that, well, it has very ambiguous effects, actually. Yeah. And another thing is that the literature is so focused on farm side productivity difference or entrepreneurial productivity difference, not really much on the worker side heterogeneity into skills and occupation, and it's largely unexplored. So I think this is an area that we could think more about. And this is in passing. Ben gave a very nice lecture last week. And then, as you can tell, if you go to his website, you can learn a lot about these methods yourself. But I teach both like continuous time discrete models and also use both in my research. What I'm going to say is that there's some entry cost, right? So for many people, discrete time actually is a very natural model they can work with. Going to continuous time requires a lot of investment. So I'd say that there's a lot of efficiency gains by going through continuous time method, but then if you're not comfortable making that investment, then I think discrete time is fine. But another thing I want to say is that, well, so Ben has the whole thing done using finite difference method, and it's really well done, and he has all the documentation. But then there's another method called the finite state Markov chain method, developed by Kushner and Dupuy, but two economists like Chris Phelan and Aslami actually have written more accessible interpretation for economists. What I want to say is that this finite state Markov chain method is basically a kind of, in some sense, an encompassing version of finite difference method. So at some point, even if you start from finite state Markov chain, at some point you will see that, oh, I basically recover what I would have gotten using finite difference method. But one thing I want to say is that the initial setup of the model is much more close to discrete time than continuous time. So here, finite state Markov chain, you start with writing down what looks like a discrete time approximation. It starts with what looks like a discrete time dynamic programming problem rather than Hampton-Jacobi equation. So I've seen that this actually has a lower entry cost for people who want to learn about continuous time methods, but are not too familiar with the continuous time basics, then this could be an alternative choice. But I want to say that eventually they are basically very similar method. Okay, so let me end there. Okay, and I will take questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so during the lecture, we talk a lot about the financial frictions as a frictions to have the necessary policy interventions. And I wonder whether this is a first order concern in a historical perspective, because if you think about the Eastern Asian countries during their rapid growth period, then these countries were typically characterized by financial repression. So so is it? Do you think it's a first order concern, or do you think this is a result of evolution of the literature?
So I'd say that actually, I mean, that's a very good question. So there could be many different answers, in the sense that the reason personally for me financial friction is a kind of natural one that I could have stuck with, is that to some degree it's easier to measure than other kind of distortions, like labor market distortions, product market distortions. It's kind of hard to measure to some degree. And another advantage, I shouldn't say advantage. One of the reasons why it led me to a financial friction initially was that there is a very clear pattern in cross-country difference in terms of the functioning of financial markets. Unlike other types of distortion, like labor market distortions, I'm sure it is kind of not functioning properly in many poor countries, but also at the same time, we also have a fairly wealthy countries with a lot of labor market regulations distortions. So it was the kind of more theoretical approach. But about your question, in some sense, the active role, I'd say that the active role the government played in repressing, like financially repressing savers, and then subsidizing firms, and also allocating credit across firms. The fact that the government had played such an active role in these countries in the 70s, in 60s and 70s, is actually a testament to the fact that the financial markets are functioning very well. So that's why the government said, okay, financial markets are working very well. Funds are not going to the most productive use. I know better, hence than this poorly functioning markets. I'm going to go in and actually allocate resources. So that's my interpretation of what this is. And obviously, well, your question is really relevant to what I was trying to say earlier, that, yeah, but there are a lot of different kind of frictions, a lot of distortions in the economy. So we tended to just focus on one because we want to work with something simple and clear and learn learn like clean insights. But maybe, yeah, one should think about the interaction between other distortions.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions from the front row or people in the webinar? If you want to enter them into the Q&A now, you can have Young's answer rather than inferior answers coming from at least from me and maybe Doug.
I have a question about quantifying the model in the macroeconomics of microfinance paper. Yeah. So I have two questions. First, you chose kind of observational moments as the moments that you targeted, and you used experimental moments to kind of validate the model. In other cases, people use experimental moments they target the experimental moments themselves, like in the Lagakos, Mubarak, and Wah paper. So how did you think through which moments you wanted to use to kind of validate the model versus the ones you wanted to target? And then the second question is, so I don't have much experience with structural stuff. I just mostly have worked on like empirical reduced form things, and there everything comes with a set of confidence intervals. But so in the very rarely in kind of like model predictions and in counterfactual simulations and things like that do I see confidence intervals. And I was wondering, so how is it common to try to quantify uncertainty? Because the moments that you're targeting have uncertainty, right? And presumably there's uncertainty in the parameters too. So yeah, I guess those are the two questions.
Well, thank you, Corey, for two really good questions. Well, and also I really am glad to say that you are here. This is part of the intellectual gains from trade we're talking about, that the micro development researchers are kind of coming to talk here what macro development is. So one thing I was not very clear about this, but let me actually go back to your first question. Here, what we're doing is that, so Kowalski and Townsend's result is this is kind of causal estimate. So they actually use the peculiarity of this Thai million baht program that each village got million baht regardless of size of the village. So that generates interesting exogenous variation. So this is the kind of estimate that they get. And then what we're doing in the model is that we are, in some sense, we're experimenting with our model too. We're actually doing exactly the same thing that we think the Thai program did and see what our model delivers. So in that sense, in that interpretation, it's like a quote unquote both experimental. And the same for the Banerjee, Glanister, and Keenan paper. Your second question is much more important in the sense that the calibration tradition, we don't really report standard deviation, which is absolutely something we should be thinking more seriously about. Once you take the calibration, but there are two layers, right? So once you have the calibration given, and these moments are very precisely estimated in the model. So you can do Monte Carlo simulation, you will get something like a very tiny confidence interval. But what your question is really alluding to is that, but there is a lot of uncertainty regarding these parameters that you calibrate. So I think at a minimum, one should actually do kind of construct the confidence intervals around the parameters, and then again, one can use like Monte Carlo models to actually generate the proper. So I think that's a really good point that this is part of the intellectual trade that we are doing, and then I think that's absolutely what even macro development people should be a little bit more serious about if we really want to be careful about. So this paper is more here. This table we have in this paper is more, but yeah, it's a suggestive evidence that the model is not crazy. We are not saying no, the model is a really good description of this, but then I think the first starting point would be to be more serious about the uncertainty of the parameter values at a minimum. Thank you.
Let's see, there's a question in the Q&A. Selena Profin wants to ask about starting points to assess heterogeneity and ability, also for calibrating purposes, especially given the nicer data availability in developing countries. Her original question, it relates to her original question, which was, how does one typically calibrate abilities of people to the data in such settings? Or is it not even needed?
Right. So I think that the availability of data is really playing a role. I mean, this literature took at some point decided that because one data you can more reliably get across many countries is the size distribution of firms. And then if you write on a simple entrepreneur production model, the size, there's a very clear correlation between size and your productivity as an entrepreneur or your ability. So I think the data, availability of data kind of dictated what our view and in terms of how we can actually infer this productivity distribution, ability distribution. But of course, the key question, another question is, well, it doesn't have the entrepreneur, obviously, right? So you have actually now more detailed, like in this, you go to some countries, you have detailed plant level data and farm level data. The problem there is that it's not always clear whether this is a census or you actually having a very random subset of this thing. But you could actually go to the data and then figure out farm level, measure the farm level productivity directly. But still, mostly capital data is missing in many cases and very unreliable. So we always kind of default back to the farm size distribution, where size, again, is measured by the number of employees in farms. But of course, with the better data, in the US, for example, people routinely estimate the farm level TFP and then kind of talk of the distribution of this farm level TFP. At the level, it does not necessarily get tied to the individual entrepreneur's ability or productivity.
There's one last question. We'll take it, but we are actually out of time. But if we have one last question, I'm happy to take it.
I'll just really quickly clarify my first question. So my question is, how do you choose whether you want to actually target the experimental moments versus target observational moments and then use the experimental moments to validate the model? Does that make sense? So in the Lagagos-Movarek paper, right, they actually target the experimental moments. Yeah,
right.
Okay.
No, okay, Corey, I think, okay, I misunderstood your question. Okay, that's a good point. So I think we didn't think much, right? So we were more thinking about, for us, it's like a learning process. And what happened to us is that, no, actually, we do the typical macro approach. And then, hey, wait a minute, we have all this like richness of data from these evaluations. Let's see whether our model actually is close enough to what we know. But if you ask me, well, if you ask me to restart the whole thing once again, then I think actually what you're saying is correct. And then we will have much more serious discussion about what should we target moments. I mean, we have kind of some observational moment, a lot of it based on, say, aggregate moments, and very kind of almost like a very crude summary statistic of some micro moments. And then I think if we're starting from a fresh, we'll actually probably take these moments, the experimental moments, more seriously, and then building the model towards actually explaining those things. So I think this is, for us, this is a process of learning. And I think in the future, the direction is pretty clear. I think that as some of the papers you just mentioned, so the recent papers are doing, I think, yeah, taking this, if this is the core piece of evidence giving credibility to your analysis, then this should be actually the target. And not only in terms of calibration moments, but also in terms of the, okay, as I said earlier, that what other features of the model, what are the features we want to have in our model if we want to speak to these moments of data. So it actually will bring us back to the drawing board. But this paper was, yeah, it was conceived much longer ago than, yeah, although it was published this year. So it was our learning process. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Youngs. Thanks to everyone else. We will continue next week. Thursday, there is no TA session. We will continue next Thursday, I believe. We'll be moving on to spatial models and trade and the like. So let's unmute and give Professor Sheen a round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, and thanks to Mandy Chan and Nadine Clark and Kirsty McNeil and Lauren Waring at CEPR for making this possible. Thank you.